You can really tell how fragile this whole economic recovery narrative was when all it takes is one headline from the Middle East and suddenly the gas pump starts spinning like a slot machine you are absolutely guaranteed to lose. All right, welcome to the briefing. It looks like the steady, planned economic recovery for 2026 it hit a pretty big landmine. Today, we're going to unpack the surprise fee that markets are now pricing in. And yeah, it's a fee we're all going to pay. Okay, let's dive into this. So here's the setup. After some recent geopolitical moves, markets started pricing in what is basically a nightmare scenario. And no, this isn't just theory. We're talking about real, quantifiable risk getting baked into the cost of everything as we speak. What's so wild about this slide is just how vulnerable it shows we are. We're looking at the Strait of Hormuz, this tiny little maritime choke point that handles about a fifth of the entire world's daily oil supply. Just the hint of a problem here doesn't just bump up oil prices, it sends a massive ripple effect through the cost of pretty much everything, everywhere. And that brings us to what we call the cascade effect. An energy price shock hits, and suddenly the cost to ship a container goes up. The cost of air freight, up. The cost to make anything that's wrapped in plastic, you guessed it, it goes up. It's literally a domino effect that slams every single link in the global supply chain. So how does this global shockwave actually hit our wallets here in the US? Well, this is where that surprise fee starts showing up on the national receipts. And from what reports are suggesting, that receipt is getting long. So get this, according to scenario analysis from Bloomberg, if crude oil prices keep heading this way, gasoline isn't going to stay where it is. It's projected to go say hello to its old friend $4 a gallon, and maybe even higher. And this isn't just about your daily commute, it's a direct booster shot for inflation. In trucking, groceries, basically every single package that shows up at your door. And just like that, the whole triumphant soft landing narrative, the idea that we could magically tame inflation without a recession? Yeah, well, a potential energy shock just walked into the party like an uninvited guest and sat right on the victory cake. The market's optimism is getting a huge reality check. And look, this goes way beyond just consumer prices. IMF forecasts are suggesting that the rising cost of everything we import could widen the national trade deficit by as much as 15%. Now, simply put, the trade deficit is the gap between what we buy from the world and what we sell. And right now, that gap, it's starting to look more like a chasm. Okay, so if we're feeling a sting here in the US, the impact in Europe is being described as something like stepping on a Lego barefoot at 3 in the morning. The pain there is projected to be just uniquely awful because of a very specific set of problems they're facing. Europe's growth was already kind of sluggish, right? And its industrial core is way more dependent on imported energy. So when oil spikes, it doesn't just sting consumers, it directly squeezes the life right out of manufacturing. You get this perfect storm of slower growth, terrible economic sentiment, and a currency that looks really confident right before it trips over its own feet. And don't think for a second that this is just about old school manufacturing. Even the tech sector, which seemed untouchable, is getting pulled into this mess. Because at the end of the day, data centers and semiconductor fabs don't run on optimism. They run on truly massive amounts of power. And that power just got a whole lot more expensive. So let's connect the dots here. Persistent inflation, driven by energy costs, makes it way harder for central banks to even think about cutting interest rates. And higher rates for a longer time, that directly crushes tech valuations, which are all built on the promise of future growth. So no, the whole AI will save us narrative does not get a free pass on this one. And here's a super specific, critical example from a Wall Street Journal analysis. It suggests rising energy costs could cause an 8% drop in how much production capacity our semiconductor plants can even use. In a supply chain that's already tight, that's like turning a bottleneck into a pinhole. It messes with everything. And just for some historical context, let's stack this shock scenario up against the infamous 1970s. Now, while the forecast of around 7% isn't as scary as the peak back then, it is a deeply uncomfortable number. It threatens to basically unwind years of progress we've made in taming inflation. Okay, so that's the doom and gloom part. But this briefing isn't about just scrolling through bad news. It's about being prepared. So let's pivot from all the aftershocks to the scoreboard. The key things every management team absolutely must be watching right now. I saw this piece of market commentary the other day, and it nails it. The whole plan was for a steady, kind of boring year of recovery, and then geopolitics just looked at that plan and said, That's cute. So what can you actually do about this? Right now, here is one single practical action item. Call your logistics providers and your insurers and start asking for forward-looking quotes for maritime war risk insurance. The week-over-week percentage change in those premiums, that number is one of the most powerful leading indicators for where your supply chain costs are really headed. It's your crystal ball. And this all feeds into your mandatory watch list. These are the 3 non-negotiable metrics you have to be tracking. First, any credible signals of shipping disruption in your Hormuz. Second, the cost of oil futures. And, just as important, those insurance premiums we just talked about. And third, forward-looking inflation expectation surveys, because that's the number that's going to tell you what central banks are going to do next. And just to really drive the point home, look at this. At the start of last year, the optimistic forecast for corporate resilience was a solid 8.5 out of 10. The projected score under this new shock scenario, a 4.0. That right there is the difference between planning for a victory lap and, well, bracing for impact. This is not financial advice, just the scoreboard. This analysis is for commentary purposes. Always consult a professional for financial decisions.